The sun was setting as Richard's sleek black car pulled into the long driveway of his beachfront mansion. He wasn't supposed to be home today. In fact, he wasn't supposed to be back in the country until Friday, 3 days from now. But business is unpredictable when you're worth 9 figures, and sometimes plans change at the last minute. Richard rubbed his tired eyes and checked his watch. It was just past 6 p.m. The flight from Singapore had been brutal. 14 hours in first class was still 14 hours trapped in a metal tube hurtling through the sky. All he wanted now was a hot shower, a stiff drink, and the comfort of his own bed. As he drove closer to the house, something caught his eye. A small blue car was parked near the service entrance, a car he didn't recognize. Richard frowned. He wasn't expecting anyone, and his assistant knew he was flying back early. The cleaning service wasn't scheduled until tomorrow. Strange, he muttered to himself as he parked in front of the 4-car garage. He didn't bother putting his car away. He'd deal with that later. Right now, he wanted to know who was in his house. Richard grabbed his briefcase and carry-on luggage from the passenger seat. The gravel crunched under his expensive leather shoes as he walked to the front door. Years of business dealings had taught him to approach unexpected situations with caution. He didn't think there was anything sinister happening. His security system would have alerted him if there had been a break-in. But still, it was odd. He unlocked the front door quietly and stepped inside. The grand foyer of his home greeted him with its familiar marble floors and high ceilings. Everything looked normal. The house was clean and orderly, just as he liked it. But then he heard sounds coming from the direction of the kitchen, the clatter of pots and pans, and was that singing? Richard set his bags down by the stairs and moved silently through the house. The smell hit him first. Something rich and savory was cooking. His stomach growled in response, reminding him that he hadn't eaten anything substantial since the mediocre airplane breakfast. As he got closer to the kitchen, the singing became clearer. It was a woman's voice, not particularly good but enthusiastic. She was singing along to some pop song that Richard vaguely recognized from the radio. He paused at the kitchen doorway, and what he saw made him stop in his tracks. His cleaner, Elena, was in his kitchen, but she wasn't cleaning. At least, not in the usual sense. Elena was a short, plump woman in her late 40s with curly black hair tied back in a messy bun. She'd been working for him for about 5 years, coming in twice a week to keep the massive house in order. Richard rarely saw her. Their paths didn't cross much. He was either at work or traveling when she came to clean. But now, here she was, dancing around his gourmet kitchen like she owned the place. The island counter was covered with cooking supplies. Pots were bubbling on the stove, and the air was filled with the smell of onions, garlic, and spices. For a moment, Richard just stared. Elena hadn't noticed him yet. She was stirring something in a large pot with one hand while checking her phone with the other, still humming to herself. She looked completely at home. Richard's first instinct was anger. What was she doing? This wasn't part of her job. Was she using his kitchen for some kind of side business? Taking advantage of his absence to cook meals she could sell? He cleared his throat loudly. Elena jumped so violently that she dropped the wooden spoon she was holding. It clattered to the floor, splashing some kind of sauce on the pristine tiles. "Mr. Reynolds," she gasped, her hand flying to her chest. "Oh my goodness, you scared me half to death." Her accent was noticeable but not thick. She'd told him once she'd moved to the States from Colombia as a teenager. "What are you doing in my kitchen, Elena?" Richard asked, his voice calm but cold. Elena's face went pale. She looked from Richard to the mess of cooking supplies around her, then back to Richard again. Her mouth opened and closed a few times before she found her voice. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Reynolds. I didn't think you'd be home until Friday. I was just—" She broke off, looking genuinely frightened. Richard walked further into the kitchen, taking in the scope of the situation. Now that he was closer, he could see that there were dozens of plastic containers stacked neatly on one counter. Some were already filled with food and labeled. "You're using my kitchen to run a catering business?" he asked, raising an eyebrow. No, it's not like that at all," Elena said quickly. "I would never—" "Then what exactly is this?" Richard gestured at the chaos around them. "Because it looks to me like you're taking advantage of my absence to use my home for your own purposes." Elena's eyes filled with tears. Richard felt a twinge of guilt but pushed it aside. He paid her well to clean his house, not to cook meals for what looked like an army. "Please, let me explain," she said, wiping her hands nervously on her apron. "I don't sell any of this food. It's for the veterans at St. Michael's Shelter downtown." That wasn't what Richard had expected to hear. "Veterans?" he repeated, his anger momentarily derailed. Elena nodded quickly. "Yes, sir. Every other week I cook meals for them. Usually I do it at my apartment, but my oven broke last week and I can't afford to fix it until next month." She looked down at her feet. "I know I should have asked permission, but you were overseas and I didn't think you'd be back so soon. I was going to clean everything up, I promise. No one would have known I was here." Richard looked at her thoughtfully. The explanation seemed genuine, but something still didn't add up. "Why go to all this trouble for a shelter? That's a lot of food you're making." Elena was quiet for a moment, as if debating how much to share. "My husband Carlos, he was a Marine. 2 tours in Afghanistan." Her voice softened. "He came back different. The VA, they tried to help, but..." She shook her head. "He took his own life 3 years ago." Richard felt like someone had punched him in the stomach. He hadn't known any of this about the woman who had been cleaning his house for years. "I'm sorry," he said, and meant it. "After he died, I needed to do something to honor him, you know? So I started cooking for the shelter where he used to go sometimes. They don't get many home-cooked meals there." Richard looked around the kitchen again, seeing it with new eyes. The containers weren't haphazardly filled. They were carefully portioned and neatly labeled. This wasn't someone being careless or taking advantage. This was someone doing something good, something meaningful. "How many people do you feed?" he asked. "About 30, Elena replied, seeming relieved that he wasn't yelling. "The shelter is small, but they do good work. Many of the men and women there, they remind me of Carlos. They just need someone to show them that they matter." Richard walked over to the stove and peered into the pot Elena had been stirring. It was some kind of thick stew, rich with vegetables and meat. "What is this?" he asked. "Beef stew," she answered. "Simple but filling. And that pot over there is rice, and I've made cornbread too." She pointed to some cooling racks on another counter. "I try to make food that will keep them full and that can be easily reheated." Richard nodded slowly. He was still processing all of this information. Part of him was still annoyed that Elena had used his kitchen without permission, but a larger part was impressed by her dedication. "Mr. Reynolds, I understand if you want to fire me," Elena said quietly. "I broke your trust. But please know I wasn't trying to steal from you or take advantage. I've brought all my own ingredients. I can show you the receipts. I would never use your food." Richard looked at her. This woman he'd barely spoken more than a few sentences to over the years. He'd never bothered to learn anything about her life, her struggles, her passions. She was just the cleaner, reliable, thorough, and invisible. "I'm not going to fire you, Elena," he said finally. Relief washed over her face. "Thank you, Mr. Reynolds. I promise this won't happen again. I'll find somewhere else to cook until my oven is fixed." Richard surprised himself with his next words. "How much time do you need to finish?" Elena blinked, confused. "About 2 more hours, I think. But I can come back tomorrow if..." "No," Richard interrupted. "Finish tonight and..." He hesitated, then continued. "Tell me how I can help." Now Elena looked truly shocked. "You want to help me cook?" Richard found himself smiling for the first time that day. "Well, I'm already here. And to be honest, I'm starving. Teaching me how to make whatever smells so good in here seems like a fair trade for using my kitchen, don't you think?" A slow smile spread across Elena's face, transforming it completely. "Yes, Mr. Reynolds, I think that's a very fair trade." And just like that, Richard's exhausting day took an unexpected turn. He'd come home early to find someone using his kitchen without permission. But instead of ending the day with anger and accusations, he found himself rolling up the sleeves of his expensive shirt, washing his hands at the sink, and listening as Elena patiently explained how to chop onions without crying. Sometimes life's most meaningful moments happen when you least expect them. And sometimes they begin with coming home early. Richard woke up the next morning feeling different. He couldn't quite put his finger on it, but something had shifted inside him after last night's unexpected cooking session with Elena. For the first time in years, he'd spent hours just talking with someone who didn't want anything from him. No business deals, no investments, no social climbing. He padded barefoot to his kitchen, automatically reaching for the coffee maker. The kitchen was spotless, showing no signs of the cooking marathon that had taken place. Elena had insisted on cleaning everything before she left. despite Richard's assurances that it could wait until morning. As the coffee brewed, Richard found himself thinking about the veterans Elena had mentioned. His own father had been in the army, though he rarely spoke about it. Their relationship had been strained at best, non-existent at worst. His father had worked 2 jobs to keep food on the table, leaving little time for his only son. By the time Richard made his first million at 32, his father was already gone, a sudden heart attack at 59. Richard poured his coffee and walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the ocean. The morning sun sparkled on the water, painting it gold. He had everything money could buy. This house, luxury cars, a private jet, vacation properties around the world. But standing there alone, he felt the same emptiness that had been his constant companion for years. His phone buzzed on the counter. It was probably his assistant, Thomas, with the day's schedule. Richard ignored it. For the first time in as long as he could remember, he didn't want to jump straight into work. Instead, he found himself reaching for his laptop, opening a browser and typing St. Michael's Veterans Shelter. The website that came up was basic and clearly outdated. A few blurry photos showed a brick building that had seen better days. According to the site, the shelter had room for 35 veterans, offering beds, basic meals, and help finding jobs and housing. They were always in need of donations, volunteers, and supplies. Richard stared at the screen, remembering Elena's words from the night before. They just need someone to show them that they matter. When was the last time he'd done something that truly mattered? His phone buzzed again, more insistently this time. With a sigh, he picked it up. "Richard Reynolds," he answered, his business voice automatically taking over. "Mr. Reynolds, it's Thomas. I've been trying to reach you. Is everything all right?" "Everything's fine," Richard replied, still staring at the shelter's website. "What's on the schedule today?" Thomas began listing meetings and conference calls, but Richard found his attention wandering. After a moment, he interrupted his assistant mid-sentence. "Thomas, I need you to clear my afternoon." There was a brief pause. "Sir, something's come up. I'll be available in the morning, but I need the afternoon free." "Of course, Mr. Reynolds. May I ask what for?" "The board is expecting an update on the Singapore situation, and it's personal," Richard said, surprising himself as much as Thomas. He never took personal time. "The board will get their update tomorrow." After ending the call, Richard finished his coffee, showered, and dressed more casually than usual, dark jeans and a button-down shirt instead of his typical suit. By noon, he had handled his most pressing business matters and was pulling out of his driveway in his least flashy car, a silver sedan he rarely drove. The GPS guided him downtown to areas of the city he seldom visited. As he drove, the neighborhoods changed, becoming less polished, more worn around the edges. He passed small businesses with security bars on their windows, apartment buildings with laundry hanging from balconies, and corner stores advertising check-cashing services and lottery tickets. St. Michael's turned out to be on a side street, wedged between a discount furniture store and an empty lot. The 3-story brick building looked even more run-down in person than in the website photos. A small hand-painted sign identified it as St. Michael's Veterans Support Center and Shelter. Richard parked across the street and sat there for a moment, suddenly unsure of himself. What exactly was he doing here? He didn't have a plan, hadn't brought anything to donate, and knew absolutely nothing about helping veterans. This was completely outside his comfort zone. He was about to start the car again when he spotted a familiar blue vehicle pulling into a small lot beside the shelter. Elena got out, struggling with several large containers, the meals she had prepared in his kitchen the night before. Before he could second-guess himself, Richard was out of his car and crossing the street. "Need a hand with those?" he called out. Elena turned, her eyes widening in surprise when she recognized him. "Mr. Reynolds, what are you doing here?" "I thought I'd see where all that food was going," he said with a small shrug, taking 2 of the heavy containers from her. "And please call me Richard." Elena looked at him curiously but nodded. "All right, Richard. Follow me." She led him through a side door into a small, outdated kitchen. The appliances were at least 20 years old, and the linoleum floor was peeling in the corners. A tall, thin man with gray hair was stirring something that looked like canned soup in a large pot. "Hey, Frank," Elena called out cheerfully. "I brought reinforcements today, both food and muscle." Frank turned, his weathered face breaking into a smile when he saw Elena. The smile faltered slightly when he noticed Richard, turning more cautious. "This is Richard," Elena explained. "He's a friend." "Richard, this is Frank. He runs this place on a shoestring budget and a whole lot of prayers." Frank wiped his hands on a dish rag before extending one to Richard. "Nice to meet you. Any friend of Elena's is welcome here." Richard shook his hand, noting the firmness of the older man's grip. "Likewise. Elena was telling me about what you do here." Frank gestured around the kitchen. "Not much, as you can see, but we try to give these men and women a safe place to land while they figure things out." He turned back to Elena. "Your timing's perfect. We're serving lunch in 20 minutes, and all I've got is this soup and some day-old bread." "Well, now you've got beef stew, rice, and cornbread too," Elena said, opening the containers she and Richard had carried in. "Where do you want these?" As Elena and Frank worked out the lunch logistics, Richard stood awkwardly to the side, feeling out of place. Through a doorway, he could see into what appeared to be a dining area. Long tables with plastic chairs, walls painted an institutional beige. A few men sat there waiting for lunch. One was reading a tattered paperback, another staring blankly at the wall, a third writing something in a notebook. "You can put these out on the table," Elena said suddenly, handing Richard a stack of paper plates and plastic utensils. "Just set a place at each chair." Richard took the items automatically. He couldn't remember the last time someone had given him a task to do that didn't involve signing something or making a business decision. It was strangely refreshing. He walked into the dining area, nodding awkwardly at the men already seated. As he began placing plates and utensils around the tables, more people filtered in, men and women of various ages, all with the same tired look in their eyes. A few nodded at him. Most ignored his presence completely. By the time he finished setting the tables, the room was half full. Frank appeared with a large pot of soup, and Elena followed with the containers of stew and rice. Another volunteer Richard hadn't met brought in bread and a large pitcher of water. "All right, folks," Frank announced. "Thanks to our friend Elena, we've got some real food today. Form a line and we'll get you served." As people began to queue up, Richard found himself standing next to Elena. "Should I go?" he asked quietly. "I don't want to intrude." Elena shook her head. "Stay and help serve. It'll mean more food for everyone." She handed him a serving spoon. "You take the rice. Just give each person one good scoop. We need to make it stretch." For the next half hour, Richard stood behind the makeshift serving table, dishing out rice onto paper plates. He watched as people thanked Elena for the home-cooked food, some calling her by name. Several asked about Carlos, not knowing he had passed away, and Elena patiently explained each time, accepting their condolences with grace. One man in particular caught Richard's attention, a younger veteran, probably in his early 30s with a prosthetic leg and burn scars visible on one side of his face. Despite his injuries, he helped an older veteran to the table, making sure he was settled before getting his own food. "That's Mike," Elena said softly, noticing Richard's gaze. "Afghanistan, like my Carlos. Lost his leg and nearly his life when their vehicle hit an IED. Now he looks out for the others here, especially the older vets." After everyone had been served, Elena fixed 2 plates for herself and Richard. They sat at the end of one of the tables, slightly apart from the others. "So," Elena said after taking a few bites, "are you going to tell me why you're really here?" "I doubt it was to serve rice to homeless veterans." Richard considered her question. "Honestly, I'm not sure. I looked up this place this morning and I just felt like I needed to see it for myself." Elena studied him, her dark eyes thoughtful. "Well, whatever the reason, thank you for coming. Every little bit helps around here." As they ate, Richard looked around the room, really seeing the people there. These weren't just homeless veterans. They were individuals with stories, with pain, with dignity. The young man with the prosthetic leg was laughing at something the older veteran had said. A woman with close-cropped gray hair was showing something on her phone to the person next to her. 2 men were engaged in what appeared to be a serious chess match in the corner. "What happens to them after lunch?" Richard asked. "Some have jobs they go to. Some have appointments at the VA. Some will just go back to the streets until dinner or until the beds open up tonight." "There's never enough beds," Elena explained. Richard looked at her. "How often do you do this?" "Cook for them, I mean. Every other week, like I said. I wish I could do more, but..." She shrugged. "I have other clients to clean for, and ingredients cost money." Richard nodded, understanding now why she had looked so frightened when he caught her in his kitchen. This wasn't a hobby for her, it was a mission, and she couldn't afford to lose her job. As they finished eating, Frank came over to their table. "Elena, you've outdone yourself again. I had 3 different people tell me it was the best meal they've had in months." He turned to Richard. "And thank you for helping out. We can always use another pair of hands around here." Richard found himself nodding. "I'd like to come back if that's all right." The words surprised him as much as they clearly surprised Elena, whose eyebrows shot up. Frank smiled. "We're here every day. Doors open at 8 a.m. As they gathered the empty containers and said their goodbyes, Richard felt that same shift inside him, something waking up after a long sleep. He'd come here on impulse, not knowing what to expect. He certainly hadn't expected to feel so useful. It was such a small thing, serving food to people in need. But somehow it felt more significant than the multi-million-dollar deals he negotiated every week. Walking back to their cars, Elena looked at him curiously. "You know, when I first saw you standing in your kitchen doorway yesterday, I thought for sure you were going to fire me on the spot." Richard laughed. "I thought about it. And now?" He looked back at the shelter, then at Elena. "And now I think I'm glad I came home early." Over the next few weeks, Richard found himself drawn back to St. Michael's shelter again and again. What had started as curiosity had grown into something else, a commitment he couldn't quite explain to himself, let alone to his business associates. "You're going where?" Thomas, his assistant, had asked when Richard cleared his Thursday afternoon schedule for the 3rd week in a row. "I have a standing appointment," was all Richard would say, ignoring the confusion on Thomas's face. Today, Richard arrived at the shelter carrying 2 large grocery bags filled with fresh vegetables and meat. Elena had mentioned they were running low on supplies, and without thinking twice, he'd stopped at the store on his way. Frank greeted him at the door with a smile that had become familiar. "Right on time. Elena's already in the kitchen." The shelter was starting to feel less strange to Richard. He recognized most of the regulars now. Patty with her army jacket and fierce protectiveness of the older vets. Henry, who had served in Vietnam and still jumped at loud noises. Louise, who was taking community college classes and looking for steady work. And dozens of others whose stories he was slowly learning. In the kitchen, Elena was chopping onions, her eyes watery from the fumes. "Reinforcements have arrived," Richard announced. Setting down the grocery bags, Elena looked up and smiled. The formality between them had faded over the past few weeks. She no longer called him Mr. Reynolds, and he no longer thought of her as just his cleaner. They had formed an unexpected friendship over cutting boards and serving spoons. "Perfect timing," she said, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. "We're making chili today. Frank found a place selling ground beef at half price." "I brought more," Richard said, unpacking the bags. "And vegetables, rice, and those cornbread mixes you like." Elena paused her chopping. "You didn't have to do that." "I wanted to," he replied simply, washing his hands at the sink before rolling up his sleeves. "What can I do?" Elena pointed to the peppers he'd brought. "Dice those for the chili. And be careful with the jalapenos. Last time you got the juice in your eye, remember?" Richard smiled, remembering the incident. He'd been so focused on trying to chop as fast as Elena that he'd rubbed his eye without thinking. The burning had been intense, and he'd spent 10 minutes at the sink flushing his eye with cold water, while Elena tried not to laugh at the millionaire who didn't know how to handle a simple jalapeno. As they worked side by side, Richard found himself thinking about how much his life had changed in such a short time. His phone still buzzed constantly with emails and messages, but they didn't seem as urgent anymore. The deal in Singapore that had consumed his attention a month ago now felt distant and unimportant compared to making sure there was enough food for lunch today. "You've gotten better at that," Elena commented, watching him efficiently dice the peppers. "Almost as fast as me now." "I've had a good teacher," he replied. They worked in comfortable silence for a while, the only sounds the rhythmic chopping and the occasional directions from Elena. "How are your kids?" Richard asked eventually. Elena had 2 teenagers, a boy and a girl, who she rarely talked about but clearly adored. "David got an A on his math test," she said, her face lighting up. "And Sophia is trying out for the school play. She wants to be an actress." "That's great," Richard said, meaning it. "They must be really proud of their mom, too." Elena shook her head slightly. They don't know much about what I do here. I don't want them to worry. She paused, adding spices to the pot of chili. They know their dad used to come to places like this, and it's complicated for them. Richard nodded, understanding. It's hard for kids to understand adult problems. Yes, Elena agreed. And I want them to remember their father for his strength, not his struggles. The conversation paused as Frank entered the kitchen, followed by a young man Richard hadn't seen before. The newcomer was thin and nervous-looking, with the two alert eyes of someone who had seen combat recently. "This is Tom," Frank said. "Just arrived in town yesterday. Army 2 tours in Iraq." "Hi, Tom," Elena said warmly. "Hungry? You're just in time. Lunch is almost ready." The young man nodded but didn't speak, his eyes darting around the kitchen as if assessing threats. "Why don't you show Tom where he can wash up, Frank?" Elena suggested gently. "We'll have food ready in about 15 minutes. After they left, Elena sighed. "He reminds me of Carlos when he first came home. Jumpy, quiet, always looking over his shoulder." Richard stirred the chili thoughtfully. "What helped Carlos?" "Time, patience, having a routine." Elena's face softened with memory. And knowing someone was there for him no matter what. That's what a lot of these guys are missing. Someone who doesn't give up on them. As they finished preparing lunch, Richard thought about Elena's words. He'd spent his entire adult life focused on building his wealth and business empire. He had associates, employees, business partners, but very few people he could truly call friends. Certainly no one who would stick by him, no matter what. The lunch rush began, and Richard took his usual place behind the serving table, ladling chili onto plates as people filed through. He'd grown comfortable in this role, no longer feeling awkward or out of place. Several of the regulars greeted him by name, and he found himself asking about job interviews, medical appointments, and housing applications he'd heard about last week. Toward the end of the line, the new arrival Tom approached cautiously. Richard served him a generous portion of chili and cornbread. The young man nodded thanks without making eye contact and found a seat alone in the corner of the room. "Give him time," Elena said quietly. "The first step is the hardest, just getting through the door." After everyone was served, Richard noticed Frank sitting at a table with a stack of papers, looking frustrated. "Everything okay?" Richard asked, sitting across from him. Frank sighed, pushing the papers aside. "Just the usual headaches. Our electricity bill is overdue, and we're still waiting on that grant we applied for. Plus, the city inspector was here yesterday and gave us a list of code violations we need to fix." "What kind of violations?" Richard asked, his interest piqued. "The usual. Outdated wiring, issues with the plumbing, fire safety concerns. Nothing we haven't been trying to address for years." Frank ran a hand through his silver hair. "But without funding, we can only patch things up temporarily." Richard picked up the inspector's report and scanned it. As a real estate developer, he was familiar with building codes and regulations. Many of the violations listed were serious, the kind that could shut the place down if not addressed. "Some of these are pretty straightforward fixes," he said thoughtfully. "Others would require more extensive work." Frank nodded tiredly. "And money we don't have. We're already operating on a shoestring budget just to keep the doors open." Richard stared at the report, an idea forming. "What if I could help?" Frank looked at him skeptically. "Unless you're secretly a licensed electrician or plumber, I'm not sure how." "I know people," Richard interrupted. "Contractors, electricians, suppliers. I might be able to get some of this work done at cost, maybe even pro bono." Frank's expression changed from skepticism to cautious hope. "That would be incredible, but why would you do that?" It was a fair question. 3 weeks ago, Richard hadn't known this place existed. Why did he suddenly care so much? "Because it matters," he said finally. "What you're doing here matters." That evening, back in his beachfront mansion, Richard sat at his desk making phone calls. His business contacts were surprised to hear from him on a Thursday night, even more surprised by what he was asking. "Jim, it's Richard Reynolds. I need a favor." "Yes, I know it's short notice. It's for a veteran's shelter downtown." "No, this isn't a tax write-off. It's something important. By midnight?" Richard had secured commitments from 3 contractors, an electrician, and a plumbing company to assess the shelter's needs. He'd also called his lawyer about establishing a foundation to provide ongoing support for St. Michael's and similar organizations. As he finally went to bed, Richard realized he felt something he hadn't felt in years, a sense of purpose beyond just accumulating more wealth. It was as if a hole he hadn't known existed was slowly being filled. The next morning, he woke to a text from Elena. "Frank told me what you're doing. Thank you." Richard stared at those simple words for a long time. In his world of high finance and cutthroat business deals, gratitude was a rare commodity. Everyone always wanted something more. He texted back, "I should be thanking you." When Elena came to clean his house that afternoon, things felt different. Richard made a point of being home greeting her when she arrived. "I hear you're a man of many talents," she said with a small smile. "Frank hasn't stopped talking about your contractor connections." Richard shrugged, slightly embarrassed by the praise. "It's nothing. I know people who owe me favors, that's all." Elena studied him for a moment. "You know, when I first started cleaning for you, I thought you were just another rich guy who didn't see people like me. Now I'm not so sure." "I didn't see people like you," Richard admitted. "Or maybe I didn't want to. It was easier that way." Elena nodded, understanding in her eyes. "Well, you see us now. That's what matters." As she went about her usual cleaning routine, Richard found himself making coffee for both of them, something that would have been unthinkable a month ago. They sat at the kitchen island, talking about the shelter, about her kids, about the new veteran Tom who had actually spoken a few words at lunch yesterday. "By the way," Richard said, trying to sound casual, "I've been thinking about the oven in your apartment, the one that broke. Would it be all right if I had someone take a look at it?" Elena's expression immediately turned cautious. "That's not necessary. I've been saving up to get it fixed." "I know it's not necessary," Richard said gently, "but it would make things easier for you, and it would be no trouble for me." She hesitated, pride warring with practicality. "I don't want charity." "It's not charity," Richard insisted. "It's friendship. That's what friends do, right? Help each other?" Elena looked at him for a long moment, then slowly nodded. "Okay, but only the oven, nothing else." Richard smiled, recognizing the compromise. "Just the oven. I promise." As Elena finished her coffee and went back to work, Richard felt a strange contentment. He'd spent years chasing success defined by money and power. But sitting in his kitchen, drinking coffee with his cleaner-turned-friend, he was beginning to understand that success might look very different than he'd always thought. 2 months had passed since that unexpected afternoon when Richard caught Elena cooking in his kitchen. Now, on a bright Saturday morning, the shelter's dining area was filled with the sounds of hammering, drilling, and good-natured banter as volunteers worked to renovate the space. Richard stood in the center of the room, reviewing blueprints with the construction foreman. What had started as simple repairs to meet code requirements had evolved into a complete renovation of the shelter's first floor. "The new kitchen equipment arrives Tuesday," the foreman said, pointing to the area where walls had been knocked down to expand the cooking space, "and the dining room should be finished by the end of next week." Richard nodded, satisfaction warming his chest as he looked around at the progress. New flooring, updated electrical systems, fresh paint, and soon proper tables and chairs to replace the mismatched furniture they'd been using. It was coming together even better than he'd imagined. Frank approached, carefully navigating around stacks of building materials. These days, a smile seemed permanently fixed on his weathered face. "I still can't believe this is happening," he said, shaking his head in wonder. 6 weeks ago, we were worried about getting shut down, and now look at this place." Richard clapped a hand on the older man's shoulder. "Just wait until you see the new kitchen. Elena's going to think she's on one of those cooking shows." Frank laughed. "She's already planning menus. Says with a proper oven she can make lasagna for 50. The mention of Elena brought a smile to Richard's face. Their friendship had deepened over the weeks, moving beyond the shelter and his house. Last weekend he'd attended her son David's basketball game, sitting beside her in the bleachers and cheering louder than anyone when the boy made the winning shot. The week before, he'd helped Sophia practice lines for her school play, reading the opposite parts while Elena watched with amusement. "Speaking of Elena," Frank said, glancing at his watch, "she should be here soon with the volunteers from that tech company." That had been Richard's idea, reaching out to local businesses to establish regular volunteer groups for the shelter. He'd started with his own company, bringing his surprised executives to serve lunch one day. After seeing the powerful impact of the experience firsthand, many had returned with their families. From there, the program had expanded to other businesses in the area. The sound of voices at the entrance caught their attention. Elena walked in, leading a group of about 15 people wearing matching company t-shirts. She'd taken on the role of volunteer coordinator naturally, her warmth and organizational skills making her perfect for the job. "Good morning," she called out cheerfully. "I've brought reinforcements." Richard watched as she efficiently divided the newcomers into groups, assigning tasks and explaining the shelter's mission. Her confidence had grown these past months, and it showed in everything from her posture to the way she spoke. She wasn't just Carlos's widow or the cleaning lady anymore. She was a leader in her own right. As the volunteers got to work, Richard's phone buzzed with a call from Thomas. He stepped outside to answer it. "The board members are getting restless," his assistant informed him. "They're questioning your commitment to the business. The quarterly meeting is next week, and they're expecting you to address their concerns." Richard sighed, gazing back through the doorway at the busy scene inside. "Schedule a meeting with the executive team for Monday, and start pulling together the shelter project documentation. It's time to make this official." Inside his head, an idea had been forming, a way to bridge his two worlds rather than choosing between them. But it would require convincing some very profit-minded people to see beyond their spreadsheets. Back inside, Richard found Elena taking a break, sitting on a windowsill away from the commotion. "Everything okay?" she asked, noticing his expression. "Just business," he replied, sitting beside her. "The board isn't thrilled with how much time I'm spending here." Elena frowned. "I never meant to cause problems for you." "You didn't," Richard assured her. "I'm exactly where I want to be, but I do need to figure out a more sustainable balance." They sat quietly for a moment, watching the activity around them. Tom, the nervous young veteran who'd arrived a few weeks ago, was carefully painting a wall, his movements precise and focused. He'd slowly been coming out of his shell, even joining their weekly chess games where Richard invariably lost to him and Henry. "He's doing better," Elena commented, following Richard's gaze. "He is," Richard agreed. "Frank said he's interviewing for that security job next week." Elena smiled. "That's great news." She paused, then added more seriously. "This place is doing so much good, Richard. Not just the building improvements, but the way you've helped connect everyone to opportunities, resources." "It's not just me," he protested. "No, but you were the catalyst," she insisted. "You saw a need and you didn't just throw money at it, you got involved personally. That's made all the difference." Richard felt a flush of embarrassment at the praise. "I should be thanking you. If I hadn't come home early that day and caught you in my kitchen?" He shook his head, unable to imagine his life taking a different path now. "Maybe it was meant to happen," Elena suggested with a small smile. "Maybe," Richard agreed. Though he'd never been one for concepts like destiny, still the timing had been remarkably fortunate. Later that afternoon, as the volunteers began to leave, Richard pulled Frank aside. "I've been thinking about the second and third floors," he said. "The bedrooms need updating too, and there's all that unused space in the west wing." Frank nodded. "It would be amazing to expand our bed capacity. We turn away people almost every night. What if we could double it?" Richard suggested. "And add some transitional apartments for veterans who are ready for more independence but not quite ready for their own place." Frank's eyes widened. "That would be transformational, but the cost—" "I'm working on that," Richard assured him. "I have a meeting with my company's board on Monday. I want to establish a proper foundation to support this place long-term, not just these one-time renovations." Frank looked at him with something like awe. "When you first showed up here with Elena, I thought you were just another rich guy doing a day of charity to feel good about himself. I've never been happier to be wrong about someone." Richard felt that familiar warmth spread through his chest. "To be fair, that's exactly what I was at first. I just didn't expect to find something I'd been missing." That evening, Richard invited Elena and her children to dinner at his house. His massive dining room, which had never been used for actual family dinners, was filled with laughter as David recounted his basketball team's latest victory, and Sophia dramatically performed a monologue from her upcoming play. Richard watched them, feeling a sense of contentment he couldn't remember experiencing before. His house, always pristine but empty, felt alive for the first time. After dinner, while the teenagers explored the beach access behind the house, Richard and Elena sat on the deck overlooking the ocean, cups of coffee warming their hands in the cool evening air. Thank you for including the kids, Elena said. They haven't stopped talking about visiting the mansion by the beach since you invited them. Richard smiled. They're great kids. You've done an amazing job with them, especially considering everything you've been through. Elena looked out at the darkening water. It hasn't been easy. After Carlos died, there were days I could barely get out of bed. But the kids needed me, so I kept going. She turned to face him. That's why the shelter matters so much to me. Carlos didn't have the support he needed when he came home. If he had, maybe things would have been different. Richard nodded, understanding better now. That's why I want to make this foundation work. So places like St. Michael's can help more veterans before it's too late. And how are you going to convince your board that this is good for business? Elena asked, always practical. Richard smiled. By showing them it's not just charity, it's an investment in people. Veterans have skills, discipline, work ethic. With the right support, they can become employees, customers, community leaders. He paused, then added, Plus, I own 40% of the company. That helps. Elena laughed, a sound Richard had come to cherish. Using your powers for good, I see. Trying to, he agreed. Better late than never. They fell into comfortable silence, watching the waves in the moonlight. Richard found himself thinking about how dramatically his priorities had shifted in such a short time. The deals and acquisitions that had consumed him for years now seemed hollow compared to helping Tom find a job, or seeing Frank's face when they unveiled the plans for the expanded shelter. You know, Elena said quietly, breaking into his thoughts. When you caught me in your kitchen that day, I was terrified you were going to fire me. And now? Richard asked. She smiled. Now I'm grateful every day for whatever twist of fate brought you home early. Richard reached over and squeezed her hand gently. So am I. Monday morning found Richard standing before his company's board of directors, a presentation displayed on the screen behind him. The faces around the table ranged from curious to skeptical as he outlined his proposal for the Reynolds Foundation for Veteran Support. This isn't just about giving back, he explained, clicking through slides showing the shelter renovations, the volunteer program, and the success stories already emerging. It's about creating a pipeline of skilled, dedicated workers while addressing a critical community need. He described how veterans who received proper support and training could fill positions within their company and others, how the goodwill generated was already translating into positive press and community engagement, how employee morale had improved since the volunteer program began. In short, he concluded, this is both the right thing to do and a smart business decision. I'm committing $20 million of my personal funds to launch the foundation, and I'm asking the company to match that over the next 5 years. The room was silent for a moment after he finished. Then the questions began, some challenging, some supportive. Richard answered them all with a passion and clarity that surprised even himself. By the end of the meeting, the board had unanimously approved his proposal, with several members volunteering to serve on the foundation's board. As Richard left the conference room, Thomas fell into step beside him. I've never seen you like this before, his assistant commented. So energized, Richard smiled. I finally found something worth getting energized about. He pulled out his phone to share the good news with Elena. Their lives had intertwined in ways neither could have imagined that afternoon 2 months ago. A millionaire and his cleaner, brought together by an unexpected early return and a pot of beef stew. Sometimes, Richard reflected as he dialed her number, the best things in life happen when we least expect them, like coming home early and discovering not an intruder, but a purpose. 1 year later, the afternoon sun streamed through the large windows of the newly renamed Carlos Mendez Veterans Center. What had once been a rundown shelter was now a gleaming 3-story facility with modern dormitories, a state-of-the-art kitchen, classrooms, a computer lab, and even a small health clinic. Richard stood at the back of the crowded main hall, watching as Elena addressed the audience gathered for the center's first anniversary celebration. She'd come a long way from the frightened woman he'd caught cooking in his kitchen. Today she spoke with confidence as the center's director of programs, her passion evident in every word. When my husband came home from war, she was saying, he fought battles no one could see. Like so many veterans, he felt alone in that fight. Her voice grew stronger. But today, thanks to all of you, veterans in our community don't have to fight alone anymore. The crowd applauded, and Richard found himself blinking back unexpected tears. The past year had been transformative, not just for the center but for him personally. The Reynolds Foundation for Veteran Support was now fully operational, with programs in 3 cities and plans to expand to 10 more in the coming year. But the numbers and achievements, impressive as they were, weren't what moved him most. It was the individual stories. Tom now working full-time as the center's security manager, Patty teaching cooking classes to younger veterans, Henry mentoring high school students in their chess club, Luis finishing his degree and joining Richard's company as a junior analyst. Elena finished her speech to enthusiastic applause and made her way through the crowd toward Richard. She was dressed more formally than he was used to seeing her, a simple blue dress instead of her usual jeans and t-shirt, but her warm smile was the same. "Not bad for a cleaning lady, huh?" she said quietly when she reached him, a hint of pride in her voice. Richard shook his head, smiling. "Not bad for anyone. You were born for this, Elena." She glanced around the room, her expression softening. "I keep thinking Carlos would be proud, not just of the center, but of how David and Sophia have stepped up to help." She nodded toward her children across the room, her son setting up a display of before and after photos, her daughter enthusiastically giving tours to visitors. "They have an incredible mother," Richard said, "and they're becoming incredible people themselves." The conversation was interrupted as Frank approached, looking distinguished in a suit that Richard had insisted on buying him for the occasion. "The mayor just arrived," Frank informed them, "and the TV crew wants to do interviews soon." Richard nodded. "You two handle that. I'll check on the kitchen for the lunch service." As he made his way toward the back of the building, several veterans stopped him to chat. He knew all their names now, their stories, their struggles, and their victories. These connections, real human connections, were something his wealth had never brought him. In the kitchen, a team of veterans turned culinary students was preparing food under the guidance of a professional chef, another program the foundation had funded. The air was filled with delicious smells and the sounds of easy conversation and occasional laughter. "Mr. Reynolds," called one of the younger veterans, a former Army cook named Luis. "Come taste this sauce. I think I finally got your grandmother's recipe right." Richard smiled and obliged, dipping a spoon into the rich tomato sauce. It was a recipe he'd shared months ago during a cooking class, one of the few positive memories he had from his childhood. "Perfect," he declared after tasting it. "Though don't tell my grandmother I said that. She'd insist hers was better." Luis grinned. "Secret's safe with me, boss." Richard observed the busy kitchen for a few minutes more, then made his way upstairs to the offices. His official title was Foundation President, but he spent as little time as possible on paperwork, preferring to be directly involved with the center's programs. In his small office, no bigger than anyone else's, despite Frank's insistence that he take the largest one, Richard found Thomas waiting for him. His assistant had undergone almost as much of a transformation as Richard had. Gone was the rigid corporate demeanor, replaced by a more relaxed attitude and genuine enthusiasm for the Foundation's work. "The quarterly report is ready for your review," Thomas said, handing him a folder. "Donations are up 23% from last quarter, and the job placement program has an 85% success rate." "How about the new centers?" Richard asked, skimming the report. "Construction in San Diego is ahead of schedule. Chicago is still in the planning phase, but we've secured the building." Richard nodded, pleased. "And the company?" This had been his greatest challenge, balancing his continued role as CEO with his commitment to the foundation. But rather than choosing between the two worlds, he'd found a way to merge them. "Stock is up, actually," Thomas replied. "The positive publicity from the foundation has boosted our public image, and the veteran hiring initiative has brought in some exceptional talent." Richard smiled. "So the board members who thought I was crazy for dividing my attention are eating their words," Thomas finished with a grin. "In fact, 3 more of them have asked to be involved with the foundation." A knock at the door interrupted them. David, Elena's son, poked his head in. "Mr. Richard, Mom says the mayor wants to meet you before the ceremony." "Tell her I'll be right down," Richard replied. After David left, Thomas gave him a knowing look. "You still haven't told her, have you?" Richard sighed. "Tonight. After all this is over, she might say yes. You know," Thomas said encouragingly. "She might also say I'm insane." Richard countered. Only one way to find out. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur of ceremonies, interviews, and conversations. The mayor presented an official proclamation recognizing the center's contribution to the community. A group of veterans shared testimonials about how the programs had changed their lives. Elena beamed with pride throughout it all, occasionally catching Richard's eye across the room with a warm smile that still made his heart skip. By early evening, most of the guests had departed, leaving just the staff and a few volunteers to clean up. Richard found Elena in the kitchen, helping pack away leftover food to be distributed to other shelters in the area. "Quite a day," he said, grabbing a towel to dry the dishes she was washing. "Amazing," she agreed, her eyes bright with happiness. "I keep thinking I'll wake up and find out it was all a dream." "If it is," Richard said, "then we're having the same dream." They worked in comfortable silence for a few minutes, the routine familiar after countless meals they'd prepared together over the past year. "Your speech was perfect," Richard said eventually. "Carlos would be proud." Elena smiled softly. "I think so too. I feel him with me sometimes, you know. Especially here," Richard nodded, understanding. He'd never met Carlos, but through Elena's stories he'd come to know the man who had so deeply shaped her life. "Would you like to take a walk?" Richard asked suddenly. "The sunset should be beautiful, and I could use some fresh air." Elena looked around at the nearly finished cleanup. "Sure, I think we've earned a break." They slipped out a side door and walked to the small park across the street. The setting sun painted the sky in shades of orange and pink, a gentle breeze carrying the scent of nearby flowering trees. They found a bench overlooking a small pond and sat together, watching ducks glide peacefully across the water. "I've been thinking," Richard said after a moment, his heart racing uncomfortably, "about how much has changed in a year." Elena nodded. "It's hard to believe, isn't it? From that day in your kitchen to all this." "I was someone else back then," Richard admitted. "Someone I don't particularly like in retrospect. Focused on all the wrong things, isolated in my big empty house." "You weren't that bad," Elena said, bumping his shoulder gently with hers. "Just a little disconnected." Richard smiled at her charitable description. "Very disconnected. But then you came along with your beef stew and your big heart, and suddenly I was reconnected to what matters." Elena looked at him curiously. "Why do I feel like this conversation is heading somewhere?" Richard took a deep breath. "Because it is." He turned to face her directly. "Elena, I've been happier this past year than I've ever been in my life. And a huge part of that is because of you." Her eyes widened slightly. "Richard, let me finish before I lose my nerve," he said quickly. "I'm not asking for anything. I just want you to know how important you are to me. You've become my closest friend, my partner in this crazy venture, and the person I most look forward to seeing every day." Elena's expression softened. "You've become that for me too." Richard felt a surge of hope. "Really?" She nodded, a small smile playing at her lips. "Really, though I have to say, when I was scrubbing your bathrooms a year ago, I never imagined we'd be sitting here having this conversation." Richard laughed. "Life has a funny way of surprising us." "That it does," she agreed softly. They sat in silence for a moment, watching the sun sink lower on the horizon. Richard felt lighter having spoken his feelings, regardless of what might come next. "So," Elena said finally, "what happens now?" Richard smiled at her directness, one of the many things he'd come to love about her. "Now," he said, "we keep building what we've started. The foundation, the centers, but maybe we could also explore this." He gestured between them. "Whatever it is. No pressure, no rush, just possibility." Elena considered his words, then slowly reached for his hand, intertwining her fingers with his. "I like possibility," she said simply. As the sun set on their first year of unexpected friendship, Richard Reynolds, once defined solely by his wealth, found himself rich in ways no bank account could measure. And it had all begun with coming home early one afternoon and discovering that sometimes the greatest treasures are found in the most unexpected places. Looking at Elena's smile in the fading light, Richard silently thanked whatever twist of fate had brought him home at exactly the right moment to discover not an intruder in his kitchen, but the beginning of a new life filled with purpose, connection, and love.